Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ange-Marie Hancock to the stage.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Well, yes, you've seen that it's going to be a lecture, but I promise it will not be one of those lectures that maybe you fell asleep to when you were in college or high school. But I do want to roam a little bit, so you'll see me kind of moving around, and I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that up front. I'm not a stand behind the podium kind of person. I want to thank Emily. I want to thank the entire staff of the Center for Community Solutions. I also want to thank Lila for that very generous introduction. And yes, I am back in Ohio after a time away. I don't know how many of you have been parents. I was a foster parent for 5 years. Whether you've been any kind of parent, you know that 18-year-olds think they know everything. And so my mother can attest that when I left at 18 to go to college, I never thought I would come back to Ohio. But now here I am, and really excited to be back. So thanks for having me. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about three things. We're going to talk about ripple effects. And that actually has a very specific definition, not just kind of when you throw a rock in a pond or something into a puddle, you know, kind of how does it ripple out from a physics perspective. Then we're going to talk about why happiness is possible. Now, as I was kind of coming into today's event, I got to see a lot of folks interact, you know, kind of in random places, you know, throughout as they were kind of getting settled. And I don't think I have to convince anyone that happiness is possible. But I want to talk about it at a societal or a statewide level, as opposed to just, are we individually happy? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to talk about why solidarity is essential in making sure that statewide or community-wide happiness is possible. But the first thing I want to talk about, and I know we have some folks in the audience who kind of lived through this, right, is the first ripple effect I want to talk about really is the impact of COVID. So when we're talking about that, what do we do when we look at the data? We actually do a mini social network analysis to look at the data. And we know that from Data Ohio that there were over 44,000 COVID deaths in Ohio since the discovery of the virus itself. When we look at that and then apply that social network analysis to the total population of Ohioans, we end up finding out that 68%, so almost 70% of our state knows someone personally who passed away from COVID. Then when we look at the data and we say, well, if you didn't know somebody, do you know somebody who knows somebody? So again, that's the other part of our social network, right? It might not be us personally, but it would be somebody who knows somebody. And when you start factoring that through in terms of the network analysis, the average person knows, and knows by face and name is what we're talking about, not how many friends you have on Facebook, not how many followers you have on Instagram. We're talking about an average network size of, people know, about 200, 290 people. 100% of Ohioans know someone who knows someone who passed away from COVID. So I start there, quite ironically, in a talk about happiness and hope and solidarity, because of course, we all lived through this together. This is something that continues to have an impact on us. Again, many of you are doing that work and making sure that, you know, again, the impacts are blunted or muted as much as possible now that we're 4 years on. But this is a reality we do still contend with on a regular basis. Most of us, when we lose somebody personally, we feel that absence far beyond 6 months, a year, could be many years that we still feel that absence, right? So this is the first ripple effect that I wanted us to kind of talk about. And this is based on an analysis that was outlined, an analytical strategy outlined by Dr. James Cook at the University of Maine. Then I want to talk about a second ripple effect, which is the happiness ripple effect, which again, while you might be very familiar with the COVID ripple effect, that's something that we've seen in the news a lot, we've seen a lot talked about, we haven't necessarily talked about a happiness ripple effect. And so I want to talk about that in a similarly data-informed way. So these are two maps out of an analysis that was conducted by some colleagues of mine at Ohio State and Scioto Analysis, who surveyed about 700 people in the state of Ohio to ask them about happiness. And the first question that they asked was, how happy did you feel yesterday? So I'm going to do a little audience interaction here because I recognize I'm also the after lunch speaker. How many of you are willing to say you felt extremely happy yesterday? Raise your hands if you can. If you can't, you can stand up. You can show in some kind of way. Okay. So we've got some folks who were willing to say that they were extremely happy yesterday. How many folks would we say were somewhat happy yesterday? Were you somewhat happy? Okay. Might have been the commute, might have been whatever meeting you had that you really wanted to get out of. Okay, thank you. Is there anyone who would like to say that yesterday was just not a great day? And we always want to create space for those who maybe feel like, you know, yesterday was just not the best day. Okay, so I do see some hands there. That's the same kind of question that these folks asked of 700 or so Ohioans. And what you see in the map that is in black and white is that Cuyahoga County, where we are right now, of course, the average in terms of the folks that they asked in Cuyahoga County was 6.2 out of 10. So on a scale of 1 being not very happy at all to 10 being the extremely happy best day of our lives, right? 6.2 is the average in Cuyahoga. Now the challenge is, of course, when we think about data, 700 people in a survey, 11 million people in the state. So we didn't ask a lot of people in Cuyahoga County. So the second thing that they did in the colored map over here was to actually group by region, because we think that data would be more reliable because it's more people that really speaks to Northeast Ohio. And when you look at Northeast Ohio overall, you end up seeing a 6.94 on the scale of 1 to 10, scale of happiness. And so these data indicate that something in Northeast Ohio is going well. I know there are at least a couple of people in here who, like me, are from Columbus or live in Columbus right now. And if you look at that number for Central Ohio, we would be looking not just up at Northeast Ohio because you all are geographically north of us, but you're also geographically happier than us apparently as well. So when we look at these numbers, this is just about the state of Ohio. What does this mean for us in terms of the entire country? We are currently, as of 2022, ranked 12th among all 50 states with regard to how we feel about happiness here in the state of Ohio. Now, about 44, so almost all but 6 of our states have a range between 6.0 and 6.9, right? So Northeast Ohio actually kind of sits towards the top of that range of happiness. So there are no states that are 10 out of 10s on this metric, but there are also not a lot of states that are in the 3, 4, 5 range either. So we are in the middle, but we are also ranked fairly high, right? In terms of middle of the scale of happiness, but ranked fairly high in comparison to our other 49 neighbor states. Now, here's the tougher question. One of the challenges of that study that my friends did at Ohio State was that they only asked about 67 people of color throughout the entire state if they were happy yesterday. 67 people. So think about that just from a numbers perspective. Remember I said there were about 11 million Ohioans overall. So one of the things we need to think about is what data is available to us. And in that context, I took a look at some of the national data in terms of different racial and ethnic groups. And this is 2023 data, and 44% of Latinos or Hispanics are very happy. And in that 700-person survey in Ohio, they interviewed no Latinos or Hispanics. Now, they were transparent about that as a limitation of the study. But again, the idea here is that we want to make sure that we're counting everyone. The Pew Research Center also found that 35% of Blacks or African Americans are very happy. In that context of, are you feeling happy, right? So far as I could tell on their website, however, there was no data about Asian Americans, and there was no data about Native Americans either. So again, whether we're looking at the statewide level, where there were certain groups who did not make it into the survey, or whether we're looking at the national level, where there are certain groups for which there is no report, right? Either way, we're missing key groups of people in understanding whether or not our communities are happy. Now, you may say, happiness. There was a great movie a long time ago called Author, and forgive me, I'm gonna say exactly what was said, but there was a young boy in that, and he was like, happy? She wants happy? Who the hell is happy, right? Like, why should we care about happiness, right? Well, we know that emotional well-being is a conduit to so many other important mental health and also community interaction outcomes. And so that's why I'm focusing on happiness today. Now I'm going to ask you, if you had to guess, which ripple effect do you think will spread in 2025? The traumatic grief ripple effect that's still part of COVID? Or the happiness ripple? So again, how many people think the COVID ripple or what's been coming post-COVID and what is to come in 2025 in terms of trauma is going to be the ripple that spreads? Okay, so we got a fair amount of folks who think that that's going to be the ripple that spreads. How many people are willing to be, despite the rain and the cold outside, sunny optimists who are going to say the happiness ripple is going to spread in 2025 going forward? Okay, so we've got a few folks, right, who are willing to say, I'm going to claim it, that 2025 is going to have a happiness ripple instead of a trauma ripple, okay? So you all have been the survey subjects for this particular question. I want to talk about why we can't tell yet, because we have some missing data in Ohio. So right now, when we think about that data that was missing from that statewide study, if you extrapolate that to the entire state, about 20%, right? So about 2 million or so folks, right? A little bit more than 2 million, 2.25 if you're talking about 11 million Ohioans, 20% missing data. So we don't know actually whether or not we could predict that the happiness ripple or the trauma ripple for the statewide data. But let me show you how important that is in Cuyahoga County. If we don't have the sufficient data to talk about the different populations, that's a missing data rate of 37%. So you really only are talking about a little over half of the population if you're not making sure that you're covering all of these different data groups. So, with regard to which ripple is actually going to carry forward, I do not have a crystal ball. I cannot tell you which ones of you were right, in November of 2024 about what's going to happen in 25. But I can say that there is a strong opportunity for happiness to be the ripple that actually carries forward. And I'm going to give you a hint why. It has nothing to do with how many friends you have on Facebook, or how many followers on Instagram, or how many times you Snapchat your teenager, right? It actually is your social network. And over the past 25 years, we've started to kind of blend our social media must be our social network. And I'm actually going to talk about your social network without talking about how many friends you have or how many followers you have or anything else. So, as my friend and colleague Manuel Pastor likes to say, it is not just what you know, but it's what you know and who you know it with That's the value of the social network in rippling out the happiness or rippling out the trauma. So, next interactive component. Happiness spreads, okay? Now, if we think about folks who are living in close proximity to each other, I have 4 numbers up here. 25%, 34%, 14%, 8%, okay? If you think about the people you know, not the folks who follow you on Instagram or the high school friends who live in Buffalo or who live in Tampa, who live in California, the people you know right here, locally, that 25%, would we say that that 25% is a family member? How many people think that 25% your happiness is based on your family member, whether it's a spouse, whether it's a child, whether it's a mother, father, relative? How many people think that that's what that 25% represents in terms of how happy you are? How is that influenced? Okay, so we've got some folks who are willing to say, if my family's happy, I'm happy, and I think about 25% think the same thing. Okay? All right. 25% is about friends that are living within 2 miles of each other. So that means your friends who live close to you, who maybe you go walking with on a daily basis or you see at church, those friends who live close to you, 25% influence on your happiness. So if they're happy, you're happy. If you're happy, they're happy. So maybe it's not 25%. How many people think that family is about 34%? Because again, we love our families and they're the most important people in our lives generally, right? 34% is your next door neighbor. Now, I don't know how many of you have lived in apartments or had roommates or other kinds of things, but remember those days if you no longer live there. And remember how important not having the person next to you either playing loud music or doing all kinds of things that you don't agree with, whatever that is, really does play a role in your own happiness, right? But the good news is it doesn't just play a role in your own happiness, you have the opportunity to play a role in your next door neighbor's happiness as well. So if you're happy, they're happy. If they're happy, you're happy. So now I know everybody's like, well, gosh, where is family, right? If it's not 34%, if it's not 25%. 14% is siblings. Not your kids, not in-laws. That maybe is not a surprise, right? That the 14% is not in-laws. But again, the idea here is that your siblings who live close to you, within a mile of you, have a significant influence on whether or not you're happy, right? Now again, when I was a foster mom, I loved having siblings near me because I could say, hey, we gotta come and do this, or can you do this with me, et cetera, right? Come to the YMCA basketball game, those kinds of things. Last, spouses who live together. Now, let me be 100% clear. I have a PhD, it is not in counseling or marital couples therapy. But this is what the data tells us about who has a significant influence, right? So the whole happy wife, happy life, those kinds of things, right? It's not as supported by the data as we might think. So again, I say this to distinguish between the social media network that you might have is qualitatively different, obviously, than the people you know and you see on a daily basis. The other thing that was surprising to me about this data is nowhere on here is coworker, even though we spend so much of our time at work, right? Now, I was very gratified to see Director Dan Schroeder recognize the people that he works with on a daily basis, right? But again, what's interesting is that we can carry that into the workplace because these are the main influences. So we don't have to worry about the workplace necessarily influencing us. we can also carry that into the workplace because we're getting it from our neighbors, our friends, our siblings, and our spouses. So how do we actually support the happiness ripple effect? Well, the research shows us a couple of things. Certainly significant others, despite the 8%, do play a role. But here's where the workplace can come in. Here, the people we work with, whether it's the clients that we're working with, right, or whether it's the coworkers that we have around us, they are what we would call experientially similar others. They're in the trenches with us. They're doing the work with us on a regular basis, right? But what should we be doing? And so one of the things we want to talk about when we're thinking about supporting and saying that 2025 is going to be a happiness ripple effect versus a trauma ripple effect is to focus on emotionally sustaining behaviors. Things like empathy, things like active coping assistance. And I will say, some of the things that I saw when I was first coming into the room today, I saw and heard so much empathy. There was so much recognition of, I see you. I see who you are. And that's why gatherings like these are super important, right? Yes, we know the world is hard. Yes, we know we are concerned about, and rightly so, things like benefits cliffs, things like changes that we can't predict, right, at the federal, state, or local level on any given day. But I think we also want to be able to provide that empathy and active coping assistance. The other things that we can do are things like providing instrumental aid, right? So that's what I was talking about with my siblings, right? Can, you take so-and-so to volleyball practice? Can you show up at the basketball game, right? Do you give as an aunt or an uncle, that kind of support to your nieces and nephews, and they get recognition from you as much as they're getting recognition from whatever parental figure that they might be experiencing. And so again, we can provide that instrumental aid, and then we can also, of course, role model as well. So we can support. And the reason why I want to push so hard on happiness is not because I'm a toxic positivity expert here, but because we actually do have some good news. We have some folks in this room I know who have been working on things like addiction treatment and addiction prevention, substance abuse treatment and substance abuse prevention. Our fentanyl deaths are down 16% in this state. And I want you to celebrate the folks in this room who have been pouring their hearts into this work for so long. Now, is one death too much? Absolutely. But I want us to recognize that critical news of 16% down. Because amidst all of the media reporting and things like that goes on every day, how many times have you seen that in the news versus the horror of the day, the horror of the day? And should we not be concerned about the horror of the day? We should absolutely be concerned about the horror of the day. But we also want to say that people who have been doing this work are doing things that work, right? And Ohio can help lead the country in showing what works, because clearly we're doing something right. The second thing with regard to here in Cleveland, violent crime is down 13%. I didn't do it, you all did it. You all do the after-school programs. You all pick up and become the social safety net for the kids that don't necessarily get it at home. Okay? You all are doing that work. And that's what keeps them out of the criminal justice system. So again, I just want to celebrate those, and I want to think about how do we integrate these into our happiness frameworks? How do we support spreading this good news, right? Beyond just posting on Facebook, beyond just, sharing on Instagram some little factoid that's kind of designed very prettily. So how do we share good news without winding up in toxic positivity? And how do we share it without discounting the persistent needs, right? Because fentanyl deaths are down 16%, but as I said, even one is too many. So how do we get to a place where we can't then say, oh, no, now we don't need the money anymore because we're down 16%, right? Because that's a real question. And I saw, it's so funny, I saw you get to see all of you, so I get to see a couple of nods going, that was my question. We're going to talk about that. So the last thing we are going to talk about is what is the actual community happiness amplifier? Because so far I've been very much focused on each of us as individuals, right? We each have significant others. We each have people in our own communities, right? Kind of the each one teach one, each one make each other happy. But we can also talk about how beyond just what we can do as individuals, how we can amplify across an entire community. And we use habits of solidarity to do that. And there are some habits of solidarity, and the reason I call them habits is because they are just like brushing your teeth. You need to do them every day. That one time that you did it, and it was really great, we are also proud of you for doing it, right? That was 5 years ago. Or that was when you were in college. Or that was when, when you were 9 years old, you stood up to a bully. All amazing things. But they're habits, meaning that they're things that we need to do on a regular basis. The other important thing about habits of solidarity is that they can be learned. They're not things that you're either born with or you're not born with, right? So this is not people are inherently born flexible. Anyone who's bad at yoga can tell you not everyone is born flexible, but you can learn flexibility. You can learn and grow in your emotional stability or in your cultural empathy. So these habits, of solidarity are ways to spread out that happiness ripple effect across a community. So it's more than just taking your neighbor some, cookies that you happen to bake, right? Because that's a one-on-one. Nobody's saying don't do that. But we're saying that you can make an even wider effect by practicing these habits of solidarity. But am I ready for solidarity? And this is a really important piece that you want to think about as folks who are in the trenches doing the work. There may be resistance to solidarity, and I think we want to be real about the challenges that can sometimes happen when we want to stand in solidarity with another population, whether it's societal or familial pressures, right? Whether it's violent threats, right? Whether it's something that's a little more interpersonal, about I'm not sure that I want to stand in solidarity. And so there is an amount of personal preparation to push past ambivalence and to think about how can I care for myself and make sure that I am ready to be a happiness amplifier by practicing solidarity habits. And then the last thing that's really important in terms of your readiness for solidarity is we need to hold each other accountable. And we need to think about the ways in which we do that. That, again, amplifies rather than traumatizes or causes each other to walk away from being able to stand in solidarity. So what does solidarity look like at the cultural level? Solidarity at the cultural level looks like two things. One, being able and willing to stand up for a community that you are a member of or that someone who is close to you is a member of, right? The second one is because then you can stand as the expert. Then you can share, this is the experience that happens to me, this is what people in my community are experiencing, and I need you to listen and understand from that perspective. But that can't be the only thing that you do, no matter where you're situated or what kinds of things groups that you actually are a member of. You also need to be a learner. Which means the second part of solidarity is you need to stand in solidarity when you are the privileged or when you are in the group that does not experience the same kind of harm. And there you are not the expert. There you are not the leader. And it's not just personally humbling and making sure that everybody's coming from a good space. But part of the work is amplifying those with what we now call, in most of what we do, lived experience, right? And we amplify. So when we talk about what we do in foster care, we want to center transition-aged youth who have the experience of what it's like to turn 18 and then not have any resources or not be sure about what their resources are going to be when they turn 18, right? Mine is turning 17 in about 3 weeks. And thank God he's back with his biological father, but I think about that all the time, right? Like, what would happen to him? He would call me at 1 a.m., and that would be 100% fine, and I would go get him. But again, the point is, right, we want him to tell folks that's his experience, and this is what he worries about on a daily basis, and this is what's going to help him get to college and become the architect that I know he's capable of, that he's always wanted to be since he was 9 years old when I got him, right? So again, we want to think about that holding each other accountable as being not just, we're going to say, oh, you hurt my feelings, and that was really bad, and you shouldn't really do that again, you know. But also think about holding each other accountable to, do we have the right balance or mix of solidarity? Where yes, there are places where we are experts, and we are going to talk about what it's like to live our lives, but we're also willing to sit and listen and learn from the folks with lived experience whose lives are 100% different from ours. So what now? You've heard about the happiness ripple effect. There were at least a few of you who were willing to claim it for 2025 and beyond. I'm going to suggest and ask you to be part of that happiness ripple effect. And in so doing, focusing on spreading happiness in your social network, again, not on social media, but in your social network, directly engaging your significant others and experientially similar peers, coworkers, using emotionally supportive behaviors, and to spread happiness across diverse communities by using habits of solidarity. So I wish you, again, I want to congratulate all of the winners for today. I'm so glad to be a part of this presentation, and thank you so much for joining me on this journey.